the Black Sea to the Atlantic, from the Arctic polar circle to the shores of the Mediterranean, landscapes of extreme diversity. The plants and wildlife of Europe reflect this infinite variety. They are conditioned by multiple factors, such as climate, altitude, soil, environment.
" 60,000 different species of insects have been inventoried in Europe. Among them, 400 species of butterflies. A great majority of these species are threatened with extinction due to insecticides. This animal, ordinary yet exquisite, brings up the question of wildlife preservation in Europe. Not all have the charm of this one, the brimstone butterfly.
Vipers, or adders, are rather commonplace in Europe, although reptiles are relatively badly represented. Indeed, although the surface of Europe corresponds to 7% of the land mass of all the continents, it contains but 2% of all species of reptiles.
In all, there are about 1,000 species of vertebrates present on the European continent, some 200 freshwater fish, less than 50 amphibians, and slightly over 200 mammals. Birds are the most numerous, with 400 species.
Partridge we see here on a rocky island in Greece is sedentary and flies only reluctantly, whereas the Arctic tern observed in Iceland is a tireless migratory bird.
The large European bird family is incredibly varied, ranging from sparrows, who live around houses, to large waders, who live on houses.
Storks are almost domestic birds, not at all shy, easy to approach. In the past, when they returned from Africa in the spring, they would build their nests in trees. Now, a sign of changing times, they prefer to nest on houses, close to the fields and prairies which are so commonplace in this continent.
Although they are a protected species, the stork population is on the decline in Europe. This stork is hunting in a Polish prairie for insects, frogs, even birds or small mammals.
In fields and near homes, one can come across an animal which is very widespread in Europe, the fox. Foxes are mercilessly slaughtered for their fur, and because they can transmit rabies. Foxes are often said to poach domestic hens and ducks, but in fact they hunt just about everywhere, in the forest as well as in ditches and on riverbanks. They most often feed on small mammals, insects, shellfish, and birds.
The dancing of little ringed plovers, the feeding of kingfishers and terns. These are scenes we can observe on the banks of several of Europe's large rivers. Beavers are a much rarer sight.
Beavers, once widespread in Europe, were also hunted ruthlessly on account of their precious fur and tasty flesh. At the turn of the century, beavers were all but extinct in Europe. It was therefore decided to try to protect them, and Canadian beavers were imported to interbreed with the local varieties. More recently, beavers were successfully reintroduced in Switzerland. But beaver populations remain very isolated and scant. Beavers chew willows, poplars, alders, birch, all trees which favor a humid environment.
Altogether, there are over 10,000 species of trees, flowers, and plants in Europe. We usually imagine the vegetation of wetlands to be limited to water lilies and reeds. In fact, swamps and marshlands contain a large diversity of plants which all have in common a capacity to thrive on the waterlogged substratum. An environment of abounding life. One distinguishes between plants that grow on water, in water, and on the banks. And European marshes present a rich variety of species in all three categories.
The surface of swamps is often infested with duckweed, a favorite food for ducks as the name indicates. Their rounded leaves are in fact flattened stems, from which hang long filaments that function as roots and float freely in the water.
Like duckweed, water chestnuts are sometimes free-floating and sometimes anchored to the bottom of swamps or ponds. They spread their leaves in a patchwork pattern that allows each plant to benefit from the best light. Emerging plants are even more decorative.
There are 3 varieties of water lilies represented in Europe, 2 yellow and 1 white. Everyone knows white water lilies, with their rounded heart-shaped leaves floating on the surface, and their bright white flowers which give off such a subtle perfume. At night, the flowers close, only to bloom in the daytime, if the sun shines. Although they don't secrete any nectar, they attract insects, which participate in their pollination. The leaves are coated in a sort of wax that stops them from getting wet in the water and keeps them on the surface. Yellow water lilies are also known as pond lilies. As opposed to the white variety, they have no petals. These are replaced by stamen.
Sagittaria, or arrowhead plants, are also commonplace, yet spectacular. In spring, very simple leaves that resemble blades of grass arise from the water. As they grow, they will take on extremely varied shapes.
When evoking the vegetation that borders swamps, reeds generally spring to mind. Reality, however, is more complex. These long stems that venture out into ponds are bulrushes.
These are reeds. They form a veritable sanctuary for birds. This plant has an incredible capacity for growth. It helps in the reclaiming of land from the swamp. Reeds reign as masters in any area they occupy and have difficulty in tolerating the presence of other plants. This plant, with its characteristic fir-tipped stem, is reed mace, more commonly known as cat's tail. It's a very elegant plant and is protected in Europe. Their names are burreed, forget-me-not, flowering rush, and they decorate the setting of the European wetlands.
One of the star performers here is undoubtedly the dragonfly. Dragonflies are absolute marvels of aeronautical technology. Their powerful muscles and 4 variable wings give them the capacity of vertical takeoff, hovering, even backward flight. If agrians indulge in acrobatic mating, it's for purely anatomical reasons. A tragic variation for this couple filmed in Romania, where love ends with a cannibalistic feast.
Box tortoises are one of the 2 species of tortoise that one can find in the European swamps. They're carnivorous tortoise, whose eyes are fitted with mobile lids. Their toothless mouths turn into horned beaks, which make good cutting instruments. Whereas tortoise are originally land animals, these have quite successfully adapted to life in the water.
Few mammals have actually chosen this environment as their habitat. The most common are, in fact, animals from North America, muskrats. In 1905, a dozen couples were imported and set loose in a pond near Prague. Since then, their descendants have colonized all of Europe.
Nowadays, due to relentless trapping, the European otter is all but absent in the swamps. Protective measures instated to save the last individuals are not sufficient, and surviving otters dwindle due to the destruction of their habitat, the wetlands, and pollution of the waterways.
This impressive snake found on the shores and in the swamps is of a variety which produces the largest snakes in Europe and is very widespread. Grass snakes can measure up to 1.5 meters and are perfectly harmless. they feed on frogs and small fish. This animal heads for the water. An excellent swimmer, it propels itself by undulating while keeping its head out of the water. Frogs and toads had better watch out.
Swamps are a paradise for animals who fancy frogs, and for all the birds whose staple diet consists of fish. Herons are the most common of the waders found in the swamps and marshes of the continent, and the easiest to observe. They're excellent fishers, as are egrets or tufted herons, which are much rarer and live only in the deltas and swamps of southeast Europe.
Spoonbills, squacco heron, ibis, and night heron are some of the fishing birds of Europe. This beautiful bird, the crested grebe, is quite commonplace. They are excellent divers who feed on fish and water insects.
A multitude of birds sit on the waters of swamps. These coots, fighting over a bit of crayfish, are very widespread in Europe. Coots don't belong to the duck family, but to that of the waders, which doesn't stop them from having all the attributes of diving ducks.
This is a surface duck, by far the most common type. Mallards are the basis for almost all domestic ducks. They are probably the first to have been tamed. They adapt well and are found in most climates of Europe.
This female shoveler duck is easily recognized thanks to its spoon-shaped bill, which is well adapted to foraging for food on the bottom of ponds and marshes. In September, shoveler ducks take up winter quarters in the countries surrounding the Mediterranean.
The swamps of Scotland, Scandinavia, Central Europe and Eastern Europe are the home of greylag geese. In the winter at migration time, they can also be seen in other parts of Europe. The geese who live in the north spend the winter mostly in England. Whole colonies leave for the south starting in October. These birds are the ancestors of our domestic geese and feed on seeds, grass, slugs, and worms.
With their 2-meter wingspans, they are the most easily observed large European bird because man has, to a certain extent, domesticated them. They're mute swans, the most common of swans. They nest among the reeds around lakes, ponds, and large rivers. They're mostly sedentary, whereas the other 2 breeds that live in Europe, the whooping swan and the Bewick swan, nest in the tundra of the north and migrate for the winter.
There are probably less than 3,000 pelican couples left in all of Europe. The species is rare and dwindling rapidly. Only in the Danube Delta are they found all year round. In other regions, single birds appear after nesting periods. In any case, they look for stretches of water with abundant fish because they consume 3 kilos of them per day.
Due to their similar feeding habits, it's common to find cormorants where there are pelicans. They belong to the same family of birds, but cormorants are just as numerous as pelicans are rare and are found in freshwater as well as in coastal waters.
These ducks live on the shores of the Nordic countries and build their nests on rocks. They line their nests with a large quantity of down feathers, for which they have become famous. They are eiders, and it is from their feathers that genuine eiderdowns are made. 2 kilos of down is needed to make a pillow, about 50 nests worth. The ducks are often disturbed. People are constantly gathering their feathers or their eggs, but they are also often hunted. Their tanned skin is made into clothes, blankets, even rugs. It's a harsh and unfair destiny for an animal with such a trusting nature. As with other breeds of ducks, the males and females are very different, with the most colorful feathers being reserved for the males. Eiders belong to the diving category of ducks and remain by the sea.
Birds compose the greater part of the wildlife of the coastal regions, and of all the birds living on the European coasts, seagulls are the most common. A dozen species can be enumerated. Contrary to ducks, males and females have the same plumage, with the young birds having distinctive brownish-gray spotted feathers.
Many species mingle on the beaches, and careful observation allows one to spot other birds besides gulls. Terns get together with oyster catchers, who are reassured by the presence of large gulls.
Oyster catchers, who, as their name indicates, open and eat shellfish, are found on beaches, rocks, as well as in prairies a little inland. One can see these birds on all the coasts of Europe, except those of Italy.
Their cousins, the crested lapwings, are even more widespread. They also nest in the coastal prairies, and just about anywhere water and fields can be found, sometimes near curlews.
Curlews are the only birds in Europe to have long beaks that curve downwards. Except for in the extreme inland regions of the northern tip of Europe, These birds can be spotted at one season or another in every part of the continent. In winter, they appear mostly on the coasts.
These magnificent cliffs and rocky capes are touched by the Gulf Stream, which creates climatic and ecological conditions favorable to a thriving animal and plant life. The rocky coasts of the British Isles are the home of many seabirds, such as oystercatchers and lapwings. There is great awareness here of the heritage these coastlines represent, and many spots are protected. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds even leases land to preserve nesting sites.
This cliff in Iceland has been literally colonized by guillemots. These narrow-winged, short-tailed birds leave the sea only to nest and lay a single egg on the rocks of these cornices.
These little rockets that dash between the guillemots are easily identified as soon as they land. With their short, stocky bodies, large round heads with white cheeks, high, sort of squashed, brightly colored beaks, they are unmistakably puffins. They make their nests at the back of burrows dug into the grassy soil of cliff tops. These birds are the victims of their extraordinary physique. In Iceland, puffins are caught with nets to be stuffed and sold to tourists.
This magnificent striped duck need not fear the same fate, even though he lives exclusively in Iceland. It's a harlequin duck of a diving breed that lives on the islands in torrential rivers. Once again, males and females have divided up their colorings.
Iceland regales us with shining harmonies of colors. This land, which is set slightly apart from the rest of Europe, is completely volcanic, and plants cling to the blocks of lava, seek shelter in small depressions. Although the colors can be deceiving, apart from a few flowers and Arctic thyme, vegetation here consists mostly of moss, lichen, and Gramineaceae. It's the tundra.
In the wide open spaces of northern Scandinavia, where strong winds blow, there are no trees and life is discreet. Vegetation is limited to a little moss and lichen at ground level, a layer of herbaceous plants, and above that, some ligneous bushes, juniper, heather, and small birch.
At lower latitudes and altitudes, northern Europe is covered with birch and conifer forests that shelter the original wildlife of the Scandinavian countries. Although they live freely in these forests, reindeer are nowadays mostly controlled by breeders. Their domestication started over 1,000 years ago, and in Sweden it is total. Nonetheless, these animals live wild. They forage for their own food, lichen, grass, and leaves, and can cover large distances to do this, up to 100 kilometers per day.
It's always an old female that leads the herd. Females, like the males, bear antlers. As soon as a reindeer is lost or weakened, it's vulnerable and can be attacked by wolves, foxes, wolverines, and even large birds of prey.
On many of the forest roads in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, one can find these road signs, indicating the presence of the largest of the deer family, the elk. They remain nonetheless difficult to observe. These enormous 400-kilo animals have a preference for sparse forests, where they feed on grass and tender young branches. Males sport very wide antlers, an ornament which is too attractive, too highly sought after by hunters keen on a trophy.
Elk are really active only at dawn and dusk. They're excellent swimmers and can run at speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour, which allows them to escape their two natural predators, bears and wolves. Very young or weak animals are sometimes attacked by carnivorous animals much smaller than they, wolverines.
These animals remain rare in Europe. They live in the mountainous regions of the taiga and the tundra, where they hide in the rocks and in abandoned foxholes. They're not very particular concerning food, and eat small mammals, birds, eggs, insects, snails, even worms and cadavers. Wolverines belong to the same family as skunks, weasels, and ermines, but are by far the largest members of the family.
Bears remain relatively numerous in the spruce forests of the Scandinavian mountains, which provide them with the space and tranquility they require. The largest of the European carnivores was once quite widespread on the continent, but is becoming rare.
In the high mountain regions of Europe, bears have become the symbol of the balance that must be maintained between development and wildlife preservation. The mountain environment probably provides the most diverse and the most difficult conditions for survival. Exposure and altitude play a crucial role in the distribution of species that also vary from the Pyrenean, Alpine, or Carpathian mountain ranges.
The Alps, essential components of the European landscape, are exemplary from the point of view of their flora and wildlife. The Alpine range is one of the richest of Europe in floral species, with over 5,000 spontaneous varieties of vascular plants, 3/7 of Europe's total.
In this rarefied atmosphere of crystalline peaks and glacial summits flies a large, noble bird of prey, the golden eagle, pushed back to these altitudes by man's omnipresence. Nowadays, these birds are protected and can confidently soar above the alpine pastures as they search for their favorite prey.
When marmots are searching for food, there's always at least one that stands guard. If it spots anything suspicious, an eagle or a man, it immediately disappears into its burrow. Marmots are mammals that are originally from the eastern steppes and which arrived in the Alps during the interglacial periods. In Europe, they're found in the Alps, the Carpathian Mountains, and in the Tatras. They live in colonies on rocky mountain slopes at altitudes between 800 and 300 meters.
In Europe, ibex are found only in the Alps and in the high mountains of Spain. This archaic species, these long-horned, golden-eyed mountain goats, have been decimated by man. They were saved from extinction at Val d'Aoste in Italy at the beginning of the century. From a stock of about 100 animals, a whole population was rebuilt and once again colonizes the mountains. The number of ibex in Europe is now estimated at 25,000. These animals live together in small herds at altitudes of over 2,500 meters. In spring, however, one can come across them at lower elevations. It is often thought that ibex are specifically mountain animals. In fact, they would adapt quite well to rocky slopes by the sea.
Ticodromes, these little red-colored birds, are champion rock climbers and perfectly adapted to mountainous regions, whereas these capercaillie grouse have had to reluctantly accommodate to difficult conditions. Originally, these animals were found in every forest.
Chamois were also originally a forest species, which is no doubt why these high-altitude mammals thrive when they are reinserted into lower mountainous regions.
Chamois live on grass, leaves, young shoots, and when winter comes, their golden coat is replaced by fur that is almost black. These splendid animals, which were once present in all of the Northern Hemisphere, can now only be found in Eastern and Northern Europe. Elsewhere, there are some attempts to restock them here and there, mostly in mountain forests, for they can live at up to 2,500 meters. Lynx were hunted relentlessly for their magnificent fur, and also because of their skill as predators.
Like mountains, forests provide refuge to wildlife, a refuge which is often menaced by forestry or development, or by pollution. Without human intervention, most of the continent would be covered by forests, whereas they now only occupy 30% of the surface of Central Europe. Everywhere else, forests have given ground to fields, plains, settlements, roads. When forests recede, Europe's most fascinating animal is pushed back to its last entrenchment. And so, the wolf resumes its frantic race in search of new horizons.
Can cover up to 70 kilometers in a day. This awesome hunter of deer, even sheep, has a highly developed sense of family and remains likable. Wolves, which were widespread in Europe less than 2 centuries ago, today only remain in Slovak, in Poland, and in the forests of the northeast.
A large part of the forests of Europe are artificial forests, cultivated as a supply of wood. They are one-crop forests, usually of pine or spruce. In a natural forest, we find trees of all ages and sizes. Mixed in with the dominant species grow various other species. In the coniferous forests of the north, pines and larches mingle with birch trees. On the slopes of hardwood forests, oak trees are sometimes mixed with spruce.
Of all the groups of vegetation, the forest is the richest in various species and the most complex. It's characterized by 3 layers of vegetation. In the shade, and sheltered by the layers of trees, a layer of bushes develops. In hardwood forests and mixed forests, the layer of herbaceous plants varies according to the season. In the spring, when the trees are leafless, numerous species of flower grow and are later replaced by others which prefer shade and humidity. On the ground level of the forest, we find a layer of sporophytes, mushrooms, moss, and lichen.
In the dry and sun-drenched parts of coniferous forests, where the red wood ant is abundant, one may encounter a curious insect, the dung beetle. The female walks backwards, pushing bits of excrement along with her feet to serve as food for her larvae.
Once abundant throughout Europe, wild boars have been completely decimated in many places. Today, thanks to restocking and their capacity for reproduction, they're once again found in many European forests. This ancestor of the common pig often lives in colonies or families. It eats practically anything it comes across, from roots to fruit, from worms to fledglings. Boars love to wallow in the mud, ridding themselves of parasites or just cooling off. When they age, they live alone like stags, except during mating season.
This great ruminant is often called the king of the forest, but it is also found in the plains. In any case, it requires a large territory. The male is practically twice as heavy as the female. The doe, who gives birth to her fawn in mid-spring, joins the rest of the herd several days later.
Deer are easily recognized by their flattened, webbed antlers. In summer, their fawn coats are spotted with white. Originating in northern Spain and South Africa, this animal adapts easily but remains wild, resisting taming even in parks.
In England, these horses run wild in Dartmoor National Park. Considering that the ground is heavily occupied, European wildlife is regressing almost everywhere. Numerous species are endangered, but man now refuses to see them disappear forever. We have found a compromise with nature in the form of protective measures or nature reserves.
Sometimes man goes even further, reintroducing species where they have disappeared, and with the aid of patient crossbreeding, replacing those which have been thought lost forever. It was possible to recreate the primitive horse thanks to related stock and crossbred descendants. The tarpan, a gray-coated wild horse which once inhabited all the forests of Europe.
The Orach, or wild ox, which disappeared from Poland during the 17th century, is revived in this crossbreeding of bovines from the Camargue region of France, Corsica, Spain, and Great Britain. Aurochs used to be very common in Europe on the plains and at the edges of forests.
But the very symbol of this preservation campaign is the buffalo, or bison, which had once been Europe's largest mammal. At the beginning of the century, more than 700 wild bison remained in the forests of Białowieża on the Russian-Polish border. The last one was killed in 1919. Towards the end of the 20s, when it became apparent that this was almost irreparable, several descendants of captive herds were grouped together. And this was how a small population was able to be recreated in captivity. Starting in the 50s, several animals were returned to the forest. By the beginning of the 90s, their population had expanded to nearly 250 individuals.
From the original Białowieża stock, the bison has been reintroduced in various parts of Europe. This animal has become the symbol of the preservation of a species, and more importantly, of the growing awareness of man's responsibility and duty to the plants and wildlife of his natural environment.